Dr. David Pendergrass. I want to do a few reflections on a video I saw of Bill Maher talking about Jesus. Well, kind of. So here's some comments.
I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I'm reading Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to
That's striking to me because you can believe whatever you want, but Bill spends his whole life debating people. I like Bill Maher. I think he's funny. And he's certainly an atheist, but I do think he's funny. But anyway, so
Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming. In fact, it's always...
Read Case for Christ.
Yeah, I will.
Give it a shot by Lee Strobel.
I like how this guy keeps talking about Case for Christ over and over, of course, for the audience. Maybe him too, but hopefully people can read the book. It's a good introductory primer. It's full of its own issues. But anyway, it's a decent intro book. Anybody who says, I'm not sure if Jesus existed, demonstrates that they have not done any amount of research at all. They might be really smart people, but it means they've not done any research. I just guarantee it. There's not a historian. I know of one historian in the world that I know of that was a historian by trade that makes the argument that Jesus was a myth. And nobody else takes him seriously. I don't at all. I think his arguments are profoundly unpersuasive. The standard view of all religious and non-religious people on the planet who's ever studied first century Roman Palestine concurs that Jesus of Nazareth existed. There's an enormous amount of evidence for that, not only in this book, but of course in literature, but as we'll go on past that. So when Bill Maher said that, I immediately know I'm not talking to a person who's done any kind of reading on this subject at all. Or two, they've done a little bit of reading, but it's been like Richard Dawkins or someone else. The point is they've not done reading by Christian specialists.
Strobel.
This is based on what? Archaeological finds?
Archaeological finds, theological finds, Ivy League.
What are theological finds?
Yeah, that's intriguing too. What is a theological find? Yeah, the guy's trying his best. And no, we're not archaeological finds. So when he agrees with Bill, we do not have archaeological evidence that Jesus existed. No, we don't. We have no archaeological evidence. What we have evidence for that's archaeologically related are cities, towns, and in customs, in fact, like mikvah baths, but locations mentioned throughout the Gospels. There's an enormous amount of corroboration. It's around like 82% of all the cities and towns and areas have been corroborated so far archaeologically. And so we don't have evidence that Jesus existed archaeologically. We don't have his DNA. We don't have a hair strand. We don't have a house that says Jesus lived here. We don't have that. And theological evidence, I don't know what he means by that at all. So we'll see.
Bill, ready for this?
Yeah.
If I told you, okay, if I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a...
That's true. So the point is, if you look at a person who does not exist, you look at other evidence of other historic figures, we have way more manuscripts and literary evidence that Jesus of Nazareth existed than we do almost every other historical character, figure, person in the known world.
It's a silly point because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is, up in heaven with his Father who's really him. Okay. That's the part.
So that's what I'd say. The part that matters, number one, is because you just said you don't think he exists. So that's what I would say to a person. Oh, well, the first thing is because I like reality. And if Jesus didn't exist, then Christianity is stupid and nonsense. It's gibberish. It's no different from Santa Claus. Santa Claus might make you feel good, might make you a good little boy or girl, but it's still false. And so the first major question is, did Jesus of Nazareth exist? That's a good question. It's a fair question. But of course, the corollary, which he's saying, well, it really, really matters is whether or not we would say the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And I agree, the reason for that. But step one has to be, did he exist or not, right?
Where the rubber meets the road, maybe he existed. I agree. That's absolutely possible. He may have existed.
But according to Case for Christ, independent sources who didn't know each other, who wrote about him within 20 years of his death, talked about these miracles happening as in real time.
Okay, well, again...
And Alexander the Great's biographers, the earliest one was like 100 years after he died.
Chris?
Yeah, that's mostly true. I'm going to say more about that in a second because this is what Bill says.
I'm going to have to burst your bubble now because here's I have to spit a couple of facts at you that are kind of going to under... Okay.
It's Hollywood.
There's only two sources in the Bible. Okay. There's the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay.
There's also
2 sources, and he lists 4 books. Maybe he meant there's a kind of gospel, but I'll come back to that in a second. But that automatically, the math is off on that one.
so another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but
He means Josephus.
read the
Not
case for
in the Bible.
Okay.
He's not
But
in
the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
which
Found 'em
were
out.
other books that were just basically edited out. So right away we know a person decided what constituted the Bible, and just some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
I get it. Council
So-
of
Everything he just said, almost everything is wrong. Not all of it. They did find the Dead Sea Scrolls. So yeah, I don't know. He said there are 2 sources, the Gospels. Then I think later on maybe goes to Paul. So the first is what virtually everyone agrees is that we have Mark. Matthew probably used Mark and it has his own independent material. So we have Mark, and then Matthew has some independent material. Luke probably used Matthew and Mark. He also has some independent material. So Mark, Matthew, Luke all have independent material. Then John, who I think scholars divide on this, that he might have had the other Gospels, but he has a lot of independent material. And you, of course, you have the Apostle Paul. And if you include 1 Peter, but even if you don't Peter, that's more controversial in scholarship. Let's do that out for a second. You show the big 5. That's 5 different independent strands. Now, those 5 independent strands, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and Paul, might all go back to one person, Peter, and they just decided to choose different oral traditions Peter told. Most scholars don't think that. They think at minimum that's 5 independent sources of information once they got the part. That's 5. So the Gospels are not one thing. They represent, and Paul represents 5 different things. Josephus was a Jewish historian. He was the most prolific Jewish author we have of the time period for sure. And he lived in Israel around the same time as Jesus. And he wrote a lot of documents, most of which is trusted historically. And he references Jesus' brother. He is independent evidence that the brother of Jesus existed. And if the brother of Jesus existed, I mean Jesus existed. And so those things do matter.
Nicaea. I get it.
Council of Nicaea,
Okay, all the same about the
yes.
Council of
320
Nicaea. So,
5 AD.
Yes.
That's when they decided the Christian
Right.
religion. I agree with you.
Right.
I don't agree with that whatsoever. I mean, whatsoever. Nicaea did not decide the Christian religion. I cannot say how overstated this is in modern parlance and churches. Whatever it's worth, if you get a PhD in historical theology, you study a lot of the councils. This is gibberish. I mean, I don't mean disrespectful. That's false. It's false. The Council of Nicaea did not decide Christianity at all. The Council of Nicaea had very little effect on anything whatsoever. They kept having council after council after council. They had a Council of Constantinople, and then they kept going on and on. So the Council of Nicaea, decades, almost a century after, then they started looking backwards and saying that became Orthodox creedal statements. But it is not the only creedal statement. There are multiple creedal statements in multiple councils and multiple synods. The Council of Nicaea is important, but it's not the most important creed ever or most important council ever. And it was certainly not the place where Christianity was founded. I mean, not at all.
I'm with you on that.
I remember that.
But I'm telling you, read
Don't
this
remember
book.
that,
That's
Bill.
Emperor Constantine.
Shout out Constantine, Turkey, all that.
Well, the first one.
Constantinople.
The first one to change the Roman Empire to a Christian empire.
They decided all the holidays.
Took 3 centuries.
I get it. And
Well, yes. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll count that. But Theodosius is the first, really. But Constantine.
Okay.
listen, Bill,
But-
I'm with you on that.
But here's the important point.
Let's do it.
There's only these 5
A
sources:
little bit more tequila, that's it.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
Wrecked right now.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Good boys.
Not contemporaries of Jesus, not even close. Matthew.
Okay.
So they lived from 70 to 110 years after him.
I understand.
No, from 40 to 70 years after.
But they got their information from Josephus, who lived about 10 years after Jesus.
So already we're into a game of telephone.
Whew. My goodness, everything about that is mistaken. This is, I don't know what to feel. I'm glad he's bringing this up to Bill Maher. I'm very glad about that. But boy, this is so mistaken. And so is Bill's point. Okay, so as I've said, many of the videos, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, for the first probably at least 150 years, are anonymous documents. We know they got names at some point. They probably got them very early on. We know that sections of them are probably being quoted by people like Papias and Polycarp by the end of the 1st century. So almost certainly these Gospels were in circulation at least by the end of the first century. That's all. I mean, no scholar really, virtually every scholar agrees with that. Then the issue becomes at exactly what decade. We don't know which decade they were composed. We don't know. And this is a long subject, but the standard scholarship is around 70 for Mark, and 75 Matthew, 80 for Luke, 85, 90 for John. We just don't know. If you take Acts as the final point when Paul is about to be beheaded, he's not, obviously in the gospel, he's not in the document, Acts, he's not beheaded yet, but he's in house arrest. He dies around 80-64. If you think that that was as far as time caught up with him, we don't know that for sure. But if time caught up and that the author of Luke is writing that and saying that basically I got you to current day, if that's true, Luke's gospel has to come before Acts, which means the gospel of Luke has to come maybe a year or two before then. So let's say in the early 60s. If that's true, then Luke seems to have known Matthew and Mark. So you have to push them back farther too. And there are people like J.T. Robinson, Martin Hingel, and others who argue the Gospels were in fact early, but we just don't know for sure. All that to say, so at least by the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, the Gospels were being composed. I think it's probably the most likely explanation for the time period. I think people were dying off in the first century church. Okay. However, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who composed them. It doesn't matter when they were composed. What matters in historical scholarship is the oral tradition upon which it is based. And that's what scholars care about. It doesn't really matter when the document was composed. What matters is the tradition inside of it. And when you look at things like Aramaisms and particular geographical, geopolitical, and even theological points in the Gospels, you know that huge portions, significant portion of the Gospels must come from the first few decades, 30s and 40s of the Common Era. So that's just a fact. Aramaic was only spoken in Aram, Palestine, and so forth. We know that Jesus spoke Aramaic. We can quote that, Mark 5, Talitha Kum, little grace, rise up, or Eloi Eloi lama sabachthani, Mark 15, he's crying on the cross. He's speaking Aramaic. He says, Abba, Abba, Father. These oral traditions carried on in the Gospels are primitive. It does not matter down the road. So this whole argument atheists typically use about the dating of the Gospels is irrelevant. What matters is the oral tradition. The other thing I would say about that is you don't know that the Gospels weren't written by eyewitness testimony. So when Bill and others say, well, they weren't written by that, how do you know that? I've heard Bart Ehrman say that they were written by that. How do you know that? I've not said this to Bart. He hasn't answered me yet because he doesn't know I exist. The answer is he wouldn't know that. He doesn't know that. And the reason why I know that is because the manuscripts don't have a name on it. So we don't know who wrote it, which means you cannot say they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You cannot say that. It's like saying December 25th isn't Jesus' birthday. How do you know that? It just wasn't the church done. There's only 365.25 days in a year. How do you know it wasn't on that day? You need to know what day it was on to know it wasn't that day. It is one of the days of the calendar year. It could have been the 25th. We don't know. It could have been, all four of them could be eyewitness testimony. In fact, that makes the most evidence is like Matthew, who is the name of one of the disciples. It's very likely Matthew, in fact, was one of the disciples of Jesus himself. Luke and Mark were not. And John, if it's John the Apostle, and that's a long debated issue too, then we have Matthew and John as two eyewitness testimony accounts of the life of Jesus. That's problematic for various reasons. All I'm saying is, one is you don't know it wasn't them. So when Bill says that, you need evidence. I would say, how do you know it's not the gospel? How do you know that? They say scholars say that. How do scholars know that? There's no way they could know that. Two, I would say, is Matthew and John very likely could have been disciples. The last thing this guy says, he means Josephus. He says Josephus, right? But Josephus, the Gospels are not, they do not ever, ever quote or allude to Josephus. Josephus wrote after the Gospels, almost certainly. There's no correlation between the Gospel writers and Josephus. None. There's no literary evidence whatsoever that they go together. And Josephus was not writing 20 years after the fact. And so all that was just mistaken. The best material we have for the oral tradition of Jesus come from the Gospels. They're the very best. For the most amount of material. The earliest material we have of the life of Jesus is from Paul, but he gives more of a skeleton account of that, which we'll talk about in just a moment. This kind of stuff in this video really reminds me of how important it is to be informed about Jesus. And this is exactly why I wrote this book. If you went to the Holy Land today, they have tour guides who go around and point out various aspects of the topography and geography and say that's important because, that part is important because. It can be overwhelming if you've never done it before, but it's very helpful to have a tour guide to let you put your attention on where you're supposed to be looking in that very moment. Well, I wrote this book, Rediscover Jesus, to do something very similarly. There's so much out there about Jesus in the New Testament. I wanted to cut through all that and put something accessible in your hands that would help you focus your attention directly on the main things Jesus taught in historical context and with some real practical tips on how to apply it to today in the modern world. Whether you're a skeptic or whether you're a devout follower of Jesus already, I think Rediscover Jesus will be a fantastic text for you individually or for small groups or perhaps for large groups like your entire church. I think you're going to find this very helpful. Go to Amazon.com to get it on Kindle or paperback, or there's an audiobook where I read it myself. If you want bulk orders, let me know. I'll give you a special discount. God bless you, and I hope you're going to enjoy and learn from Rediscover Jesus. Get yours today.
Okay.
Bill, yes, but
the other
I want to let you make a point, but let me just quickly. The game of telephone, yes, I agree with you that point, but the game of telephone in Jesus' times, according to Lee Strobel in the case of Christ, was the simple fact of we're playing the game of telephone. There's 10 people here. The game of telephone, as we know it today, is you say something in my ear and then it goes around 10 times, and by the time it gets to you, it's something radically different. This game of telephone, this ancient game of telephone was, but you tell it to me, then the third guy confirms what you said before it goes to the fourth guy. So there's a level of...
Okay, so I'll pause there. Frank says, according to Lee Strobel, the reason why that is almost certainly what happened. So we cannot prove exactly how it was called the traditioning process occurred. We don't know exactly how it happened. We have implications, but we don't know exactly how it happened. So what scholars do is we make educated guesses based on a few things. One is people have studied, like a guy named Kenneth Bailey. You study how oral traditions worked, how they work today in Middle Eastern culture. So people who live there for a long time, they live there and they say, this is how it works today. And you might work backwards and try to devise how it worked in the first century. But you also look at the way the rabbis talked about how they passed on instruction. The problem with the rabbis, of course, is most rabbis, what we have in the Mishnah and the Talmud, were way after the Gospels. And so sometimes it can be anachronistic. There's one document called the Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah. It's the earliest. It's not long after the life of Jesus at all. And there we have indication that the disciples were very well known to memorize the teachings of their master, the Lord, the Rabbi, which means my great one. And so we know they did that a lot. So there's different reasons why scholars think that when you piece together different other things, it makes the most sense of the data. But we don't know for sure. But what is probably the case, what I find the most persuasive, is a kind of example he just gave, which is, and this because there's such an interconnected network of churches in the first several decades of the early church based on what we see in the Gospels, particularly the book of Acts. And then later on, we see, for example, the letters of Ignatius, who writes to multiple different churches. And you see this all, for example, Revelation, the church of seven churches of Asia Minor. There's multiple examples where we see there's a close interconnectedness of the churches. And then even later on, while we get to Tertullian, he also says, basically, if you have questions about the manuscripts, go look at the original ones, like in Corinth. So we have a lot of indications that give us reason to think that is evidence of the fact that the earliest churches communicated and then kept checking and the communication kept going back and forth. So as Peter and James and John and others, and of course Paul, as they traveled to churches and back to Jerusalem and to a church and back to Jerusalem, back and forth, they would meet their pillars, and the original first-hand testimony would be right there in front of them all the time. And so when you get to the church at Ephesus, the church at Corinth, they would say these stories. They have every reason to say this story is true because I heard it from Peter himself. He was a first-hand eyewitness of Jesus himself. And so as this kept repeated over and over and checked, there's no doubt that it was not done perfectly. They're humans. But the gist of these stories absolutely would have taken on a formulaic kind of thing, a traditioning process, and that's almost certainly what got composed. So the telephone game is a bad analogy. It's disanalogous to what almost certainly happened in the early church that formed the Gospels.
Case for Christ.
Or construct this scaffolding to which you hang this belief. Just believe it. It's all good.
Okay.
But it's
Don't come to me, and when you die at St. Peter's, I'm not getting you in.
But you know, I can't go there with you. It's just, you know, it's silly. And
well, I'm just.
See, silly. No, this is where. I mean, okay, you can believe it's silly. I don't. I mean, there's what? I don't know, 1 million books and articles on the subject. There are tens of thousands and thousands of brilliant, genius specialist historians and biblicists, people who read a dozen languages. I mean, these are some of the smartest people in the world. It's not just only scientists. There are brilliant chefs and brilliant poets, and there are brilliant historians. And that they all study stupid, silly myths. I mean, it's dismissive and stupid, but it's really stupid. It's silly. It's silly to think it's silly. You might, maybe your version of you think is out there might be silly. Well, I think that's silly too. I think Scientology is silly, but I'm at least pay attention to it, and then I listen to the facts. And so far, Bill's demonstrated that he knows almost any of the facts to dismiss it as silly.
It's nice, the idea to believe in something. I'm just trying it on for size.
Here's also what's very interesting, and then I'll leave this subject, is, excuse me, I think I've bored the audience with this before, but...
What do you think Barbara in Milwaukee gives a... They turned this off, when they found out I wasn't Ellen.
Yeah, like that's the kind of audience we have.
Your audience is great.
So...
you think they'll like me?
St. Paul.
Good guy, St. Paul, a.k.a. Saul, and the capital of Minnesota.
Is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the two names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 50, in the 50s.
Okay.
I'll pause it for a second because I've already covered all that. So what you just said, if you go back and remember the part of the video, I already covered this part. So I don't find what you just said persuasive. It's possible, but it's also irrelevant because when it was composed is irrelevant. So here's a Paul in the 50s.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later. But actually, St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels. So the people who came...
That's absolutely false. If he's ever... I wonder where he got this from. I suspect it's some Jesus Mythicist or YouTube or something. Paul absolutely constantly refers to Jesus. Jesus came in the flesh. Read Romans 1, Galatians. It's all over. Paul believed that Jesus was crucified. Romans 15, the crucifixion is all over the place. He was buried. He was crucified. He was buried. He was raised again. He came to earth. Paul very much believed in a human Jesus. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. And he says, Paul doesn't, you would think Paul knew more than they do. Why would you think that? See, because it's earlier. This is also a false assumption. Just because something's earlier doesn't mean you know more of the thing. The only reason you know more of a thing is if you are around the thing more. And Saul Paul, based on the evidence we have, was not a disciple of Jesus. That not in his ministry wasn't. Paul didn't come into the Christian family, as it were, until after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So he was not there like Matthew, Mark, like Matthew and John, and Andrew and Peter, and all the biggies, the 12, or at least 11, until Judas killed himself. So Paul would not have known more. He would have only have known what was passed on to him through oral tradition. So it is not at all surprising that Paul does not cite tons of gospel stories. He had to have been taught those things. Secondly, there's an argument from silence here. It's silly to think that because Paul doesn't mention it, he doesn't know it. I mean, it's ridiculous. If I send a text to my son right now and go, we're eating pizza tonight, and someone goes, your dad's an idiot. All he knows about is pizza. What? You said he went to school, got 3 degrees. All he knows about pizza. That's all he wrote down. I mean, it's ridiculous. The purpose of this text is to say, let's get pizza for dinner. The point is, it's exact analogous to what happened to Saul Paul when he wrote letters to the churches. He had very particular things he was trying to accomplish, pastoral needs, very particular things. He was writing a gospel. Gospels are gospels. Gospels are a kind of life, a kind of ancient biography. That's why gospels are so important for us to understand the life of Jesus. But the letters of Paul are not a life of Jesus. And so everything Bill's saying, all the reasoning he thinks he's coming to conclusions really are false.
Later, no more than the person who wrote earlier. Just some food for thought.
But, okay, I understand. But he does acknowledge at some point, right? Paul, a.k.a. Saul, knows that Jesus existed, right? He talks about him.
He talks about, I'm saying he conceives him as a Godhead. He doesn't have this, it's not the narrative that's in the Gospels of Jesus went around and he did miracles and he did stuff and everybody loved him and he...
Well, right, Bill. That's right. That's right. And that's right. That's exactly, he did not do that. Back to what I said, because of the genre. That's right. Nor did Paul. Paul also didn't write an apocalypse. He didn't go around and talk about the end of the planet and suns melting and blood and moons and blah, blah, blah. He didn't write an apocalypse. He didn't talk about roses red, violets blue. He didn't write poetry. He didn't talk about 350 degrees and you put eggs and you turn films cake. He didn't write a cookbook. I mean, we can do this all day long. That's exactly right. He didn't. That has nothing to do with whether or not there's historical data inside of the letters of Paul. And we look at the letters of Paul, we know for a fact that Paul believed in an earthly Jesus who was a Jew, born on earth, lived in ministry in Galilee. He knew Jesus' brother. He knew Jesus was crucified, he was resurrected and ascended, and on and on. So all the outline of the Gospels, Paul is very aware of it.
Gets quoted a lot. He makes speeches. Blessed are the meek. You know, he has adventures. He goes into the desert. It's a whole thing.
But what about...
And then at the end, it's a whole drama with, you know, he's crucified. Oh, no. Paul doesn't know any of this. All the stuff that the gospel writers obsess about and that are his biography. It's a little strange.
But Paul, it's okay for Paul to...
So I've already addressed that. You have no idea that Paul didn't know it. And some of the examples you gave, like crucified, Paul mentions none of this. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's demonstrably false.
Be somebody who maybe... There was a lot of people who didn't like Jesus.
You know what's okay?
And that's okay.
What's okay is that some people believe and other people don't. That's what's okay. It's like, that's you.
Yeah.
And
I'm not trying to put it on you. I'm just saying what I believe.
I know. And
I'm wearing a corduroy shirt my mother got me for Christmas.
Okay is that some people believe and other people don't. That's what's okay. It's like, that's you.
I'm not trying to put it on you. I'm just saying.
Okay, that's enough for what you said for now. The clip's basically over. And I hope this is a good example. I'm not trying to obviously be rude to Bill Maher. Again, I personally, I like his humor a lot, but he can be very crude and so forth. But I think it's very funny. But these are great examples of how when a person talks to you very confidently about the Bible or Jesus, they can be overwhelmingly wrong, really. And so where you get your information matters. Two, it also demonstrates when you're a Christian, it's okay to say, I don't know if that's right. That doesn't sound right to me. Or can I get back to you? Can I get your email address or a phone number? And so forth. What I like about what this Christian did is, to a degree, he tried to get Bill to read another book. And so the guys, I think he's recognized, I'm not the specialist here, of course, nor is Lee Strobel, but he's at least saying you ought to read another book that's got more facts and figures. And the average Christian is not prepared on the spot to talk about oral traditioning processes, and that's fine. But I do encourage you, as much as you can, like this guy, be willing to engage. I like that the guy did a great job coming across as being funny or silly or lighthearted or whatever, and capital of Minnesota, things like that. I think that's engaging and winsome. I think that's a good thing. I just would try your best not to concede points that are false. Like, that's right. Unless you know for a fact it's true, I wouldn't concede that. I go, I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But let me look at the research on that. Let me get back to you. Those are quick thoughts on that. And more below, let me know your thoughts. If there are any videos like this on Bill Maher, other people, and make some reflections on, let me know. God bless you. I'll see you next time.